Leah had always believed her grip on reality to be pretty firm. After all, it was nothing less than a necessity for her work as a nurse at the psychiatric ward. She could only properly care for her patients and lead them back to an ordinary life if she was able to clearly differentiate between facts and contrivances. Of course, Leah knew that everyone experienced reality differently. But there was always a baseline. One person could walk into the waiting room at the dentist's office and perceive the stranger sitting there to be welcoming, while another could see their expressions as hostile. Both experiences were perfectly valid and signs of someone adapted to life outside of a ward. But if a third person entering saw the people in front of them gradually vanish, first their features, which made their faces turn into blank screens of flesh, then the rest of their bodies, until there was no one left in the room, and believed this to be real, that particular individual needed her help. This credence, that there was an objective reality structured by certain immutable laws, gave Leah the sure footing she needed in her line of work, even when dealing with difficult patients. That was until Arthur arrived at the ward. There was nothing out of the ordinary about him at first. Before Arthur's hospitalization, the 30-year-old biology teacher had taken a leave from his job to travel through Europe alone. After his return, he suddenly started to suffer from psychotic episodes. Growing increasingly worried, Arthur's family made him consult a psychiatrist, who diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia. Shortly after that, he was sectioned to Leah's ward. Arthur's illness manifested itself mainly in delusions about an imaginary world called the Hive, a carnivorous cosmos filled with strange beings that wandered through the multiverse and latched itself onto other worlds to consume them from time to time. According to Arthur, he had stumbled into the Hive by accident during his sabbatical, when it was passing our universe on its search for new prey. Like an ant that somehow found itself on a train plowing through alien landscapes it was never supposed to see, he travelled alongside the Hive and watched it devour one world after the other. He wasn't able to tell how long he had actually stayed inside, because it obeyed to completely different laws of time and space. But when the Hive finally passed his world again on its well-trodden hunting path, and Arthur ended up back exactly where he had been taken along, he quickly realized that only a few days had passed since his disappearance. After his return, he saw it as his duty to warn humanity about the danger that was lurking beyond the confines of our universe. He wrote countless letters to governments, NGOs and science agencies. When they didn't react, he took it upon himself to compile all the knowledge he had gathered during his time in the Hive into an encyclopedia and publish it on the internet. He secluded himself in his flat and began writing for days on end without ever sleeping. When he was finally hospitalized, he was refused a laptop with internet connection to continue his work. His wish for drawing utensils was granted though, and so the initially bare walls of his small room at the ward were soon clustered in countless sketches of the unimaginable things he had seen. They were done in wash, broad strokes conveying a certain urgency and accompanied by detailed annotations that made them seem like explanatory pictures in biology textbooks. While Leah administered the weekly injection of Leponics to Arthur, Dr. Lemaire would ask him questions, which spawned elaborate lessons about the Hive and its inhabitants. Although there was a multitude of beings populating that world, Arthur would explain, they all acted in unison to reach their common goal of finding and devouring other universes. In that regard, the wandering realm resembled a superorganism, with the difference that its various functions weren't assigned to highly specialized individuals of the same kind, but instead to entire species whose whole existence fulfilled one singular purpose. There were, for example, the censors, unbelievably massive entities living on the fringes of the Hive that looked a bit like sea anemones, who possessed tentacles the size of light years, which were used by the Hive to feel other worlds it could prey on. Then there were the messengers. Similar to insects emitting different pheromones, the spiral-shaped beings traveled through the void and influenced the atmosphere of the planets the various species resided on, triggering different responses and thus ensuring the communication throughout the Hive. And finally, there also existed beings Arthur termed the stingers, which hooked their galaxy-spanning tails into the very fabric of the universe that would fall victim to them. When Arthur talked about the Hive and its residents, he mostly did it in the emotionless inflection that was typical for people affected by schizophrenia. There was one particular type of being from the Hive that filled him with fear, though. Whenever Dr. Lemaire pointed to one of the drawings of it, Arthur's voice would start to quiver almost unnoticeably. He never referred to them by a particular name, but they had the central role of actually devouring other universes. Apparently they underwent an elaborate metamorphosis during their life cycle, but Arthur's drawings only ever showed their middle stage, a dark grey chrysalis with the same golden pattern that covered all the other denizens of the hive. They would enter the worlds they preyed on unseen and enfold themselves in their cocoons right away, dangling from overhangs, branches, or other surfaces. Once they reached their final stage, they would emerge from the chrysalis and, as Arthur put it, slowly dissolve the threads of reality. It never became clear what he actually meant by this, but it seemed to entail the gradual disappearance of all the smaller parts that objects and life forms were made of, without any actual physical devouring. Leah clandestinely enjoyed listening to all these stories. As with all of her schizophrenic patients who had systematic delusions, she couldn't help but feel a certain fascination for the elaborate worlds Arthur's mind conjured, and soaked up every detail of them, while taking utmost care to still retain her professional distance on the outside. This was easy enough for a while, especially since Arthur was a relatively pleasant patient. About 4 months into his hospitalization, though, he had an unexpectedly severe episode where all of a sudden he was convinced that the hive had finally latched onto our universe and planted a chrysalis in his room. When Leah and Dr. Lemaire entered Arthur's cell that day, they found him cowering in one of the corners, eyes wide open and fixed on the ceiling. As soon as he realized that the door was open, Arthur promptly detached himself from whatever ghastly thing he was seeing and tried to flee. Dr. Lemaire managed to stop him, but Arthur resisted so violently that Leah had to get 2 other nurses to cuff him to his bed and give him diazepam. Noticing that his resistance was fruitless, he started begging Dr. Lemaire to transfer him to another room. Leah found herself struggling to bear Arthur's whimpering when his request got declined, but she still managed to stay with him until the sedative silenced his despair, and he finally dozed off into an oblivious haze. The day after this incident, he had disappeared without a trace. No one at the ward knew how this could have happened. Even if the effects of the sedatives had worn off faster than expected, he couldn't have freed himself from the restraints without any help. The cameras in the hallways also didn't show anyone entering or leaving the room. The police came and questioned Leah, Dr. Lemaire, and the nurses who had been on night duty at the ward when Arthur disappeared, but to no avail. Arthur's vanishing troubled Leah more than she deigned to admit. Against her better judgment, she even began to ponder, only hypothetically of course, if he might actually have told them the truth. A while ago she had read this study about the concept called depressive realism, which claimed that people struggling with depressions had much more rational views of themselves and the world than non-depressive people. What if the same thing could be said about Arthur and other people afflicted by schizophrenia? What if their hallucinations were not delusions, but rare glimpses into other universes equally real as ours? Wouldn't this mean that she and all the other people who considered themselves sane were actually ones in need of treatment, since they just went on with their lives, day in and day out, without ever noticing these unspeakable things hiding around them in plain sight? Graduating, going to work, marrying, buying houses, all this seemed so aggravatingly, so unbearably delusional in the face of the horrors that Arthur had talked about. In the end, these doubts didn't take hold of her, though. The people at Leah's ward were still suffering, regardless if they spoke the truth or not. What other choice did she have than to carry on helping them? With a frightening ability to bury even the strangest happenings under mountains of ceaseless drudgery, Leah's daily life at the ward made her forget about Arthur after a while. And it would probably have stayed that way, if it weren't for one particular occurrence a couple of months later. One night, she had trouble falling asleep and stood restlessly in bed next to her partner Eugène for a couple of hours. Finally, she opted for sleeping on the back and nodded off. Stuck in the nebulous zone between wakefulness and dreaming, she suddenly had the impression that the shadows the streetlights cast on her ceiling started to thicken and droop in a long, dark thread. A few inches above the floor they stopped and began to shift into the shape of something that Leah hadn't thought about in a long time. It was the chrysalis. Just a few paces away from the foot of her bed, it dangled from the ceiling, attached to it with a shadowy hook protruding from its abdomen. Convulsions sped like chitinous waves over its swollen body, clad in a hypnotizing golden pattern. Leah stared at them, unable to move. After a while she noticed that the intervals between the pulses became shorter and shorter. Then the dotted, dark grey outer hull began to recede downwards, slowly revealing what was beneath. During the whole process, a liquid in an unidentifiable color oozed from the fissure in the husk and trickled to the floor. When Leah saw the thing emerging from the chrysalis, she panicked. This finally broke her stasis, and she managed to reach for the light switch. It dispelled the vision right away. There was nothing hanging from the ceiling. Her bedroom was blank and inconspicuous as usual. "What's wrong?" Eugène asked dozily. "Nothing," Leah replied, trying to banish the shiver from her voice. After catching her breath, she tried to bring herself to sleep again, This time she would lie on the belly though, just for good measure. It didn't take long until she finally fell into dreamless slumber. When she woke up the next day and instinctively reached for Eugène next to her, her hands were grasping at nothing. She was slightly surprised, but didn't think too much of it. She assumed that it must be one of the rare occurrences where he got up before her. Suddenly, the memory of the last night came back. She spun around, almost expecting to see the thing that had emerged from the chrysalis hovering over her, but the room was still empty. She sighed in relief. It must simply have been sleep paralysis, which she experienced from time to time. Nothing to worry about, especially since it was not an uncommon thing in such a stressful line of work as hers. She straightened herself up in bed. Then she got up, her naked feet scuffling over the damp floorboard. Halfway down the bedroom, she stepped into something cold and liquid. She looked down and froze on the spot. Contrary to what she had expected, it was neither shock nor relentless fear that washed through her motionless body when she realized what she had walked into. Instead, all she could think of in this moment was the sight of Arthur's gaze clinging to the ceiling of his room, and how back then she had been unable, so blessedly unable, to grasp the terror that had gripped every single one of his features until his face finally vanished.